Hey, you are listening to the Victims and Villains podcast, a podcast extension of the nonprofit which educates and engages individuals on mental health awareness and suicide prevention through pop culture. My name is Captain Nostalgia, and on this episode, we are getting naughty international. We're talking about religion. We're talking about Paul Verhoeven. We're talking about Benedetta on this episode, and I am joined by the ever lovely Miss Kelly-Reynolds of the Boobies and Noobies podcast.
I always love the way you say boobies and newbies. Like I feel like every time you say it, it's like a new take on the podcast. So I'm thrilled to be here once again.
I feel like by this point in our relationship of at least podcasting, we have this like uh just very unique like takes that we do. So it's like we've done Mean Girls, we've done Jennifer's Body, we've done Oklahoma, we've done some romance novels for your
Mhm.
podcast, and it's always like it's always a very distinct taste. And I think this might be the most mature we've ever gone as far as content or conversation.
Oh yeah, I mean from Showgirls to Benedetta, like it's both Paul Verhoeven, but it's a major step up.
There's a low key part of me that like wants to do a Paul Verhoeven like limited series podcast where I just go through all of his movies. Because he's got some like really wild and crazy ones. Like You Don't Know Me does a really great job at kind of like exposing like his RoboCop like
Yeah.
career, and then his like post Hollow Man career as well. And this one, I'm not gonna lie, I invited you on this podcast just so I had a reason to pay the, the rental fee to see this movie.
Well, and honestly, I mean, he's a creator where I could see like an entire like college course at like a film school dedicated to like analyzing his films. Like it really is interesting to me like the canon that he's had as far as like his film career has gone. So this was his first movie of his that I've seen in a long time, other than rewatching Showgirls, of course. But his more recent work, like I don't know the last time I actually saw a recently made Paul Verhoeven movie.
It's been a long time since I've seen one like this, yeah, too. And also at the same time, like this is a movie that Paul Verhoeven like has had uh a career in multiple markets when it comes to
Mm,
cinema because he's originally from Holland, I want to say, or Finland, one of those two, and
okay,
his movies were viewed as too extreme for that market at the time.
I
And so
remember
he came
that.
over to America and made RoboCop and stayed here for a little while, and then this is actually his second French movie, which after watching this, I really want to go back and see it. So his movie before this was French, and it was called Elle, and it also has the same actress that plays Bernadetta in it. So this is the second time that they work together.
Okay. And you know what? I actually remember hearing about that movie, like just the title, but I don't think I did. I don't think I saw that one, but I will say I did appreciate the fact that you gave me a French film just because I took French throughout high school and this gave me a great reason to like revisit the French language. And so I'm watching it thinking, ooh, I kind of know what they're talking about, like a little bit.
I have some movie recommendations for you then.
I'm all for it. I
It's
love European movies.
some that you might actually one that I think you actually might like. It actually cracked my top 10 favorite movies a few years ago. It's a great movie. But no, like I love French films. Like French
Mm.
is kind of like the my second favorite films to visit behind obviously the good and the bad that Americans make. But there's just something about French cinema that's like it's very eloquent and it's very articulate with its delivery. And I feel like Benedetta is a great example of that, where I think it got let's kind of break down the buzz around this movie first. So this movie it garnered a lot of buzz last summer because of its quote the raciest movie that Verhoeven's ever done. And while there is true, I think a lot of people's like intro to this movie is the sexual aspect. And when you think about it, like the sex in this movie is not really all here. Like, yes, there's a couple racy scenes, but like
Mhm.
rewatching it on a second time, I just have to say that like this movie is so much more than sex. Like, yes, like there is a relationship at the core, but it's like so minuscule compared to the larger things that is actually happening in the narrative.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And honestly, I hadn't heard anything about this movie until you asked me to watch it with you. And so I was kind of excited to come into this blind. And now having heard that from you, I never, if somebody was to ask me to like describe this movie, racy would like never be one of the words that I would use to describe this. Like, especially as somebody who reads a lot of erotic content on like a daily basis for boobies and noobies, this this doesn't, fit in with like that terminology. Like I could see erotic being used, but racy to me has like a negative connotation. And I don't see that attached to like the sensuality of this movie. It doesn't come across as like racy to me.
I 100% agree with you. I think that this movie it never comes across racy, and I think that a part of that is how the French as a film industry actually are able to articulate
Mm-hmm.
things like sex and romance and like forbidden relationships. And I think that it's just a completely different take on it because to me, when I was like watching for this to come to America, so much of what I was watching it for is because this, to me, the synopsis always kind of struck me as what Verhoeven was trying to do with Showgirls, making this
Mm,
like very serious film where at the core of it you kind of have this lesbian-esque relationship between
yeah.
the protagonist and antagonist, and but there's so many other things that happen in that movie, and I feel like for this film you have those two, those two protagonists, they fall in love, but
Mm-hmm.
that's such like a subplot buried under, it's like a probably like a tertiary subplot that's buried kind of under the large looming nature that is this film as a whole.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree for sure. And it's something that I wish there had been more focus on in Showgirls. So I love that. And I think I think he does walk a fine line in this movie. Like I think this, especially when you're talking about a male, a creator, a male director who's writing a movie that's focusing on like not just the female point of view, but also like there are some very sensual love scenes between women. And I think there's always the risk of it coming across as like a little too male gaze ish. And I don't know if he necessarily went that route with it. Like I actually felt okay watching it, and I went into it with the bias of thinking this is the guy who made Showgirls. Showgirls came across as very male gazy, so I have a worry that that's where this is going to go, and it didn't for me. So I think it's just kind of a testament to seeing like how creators can also like grow with their art. So job well done.
I also don't want to like compare this movie so much to Showgirls. Like I
No.
want to get away from that trap. We're both fans of Showgirls, so if you guys haven't checked out our podcast on
Oh
the
boy.
legacy of Nomi Malone, go check it out. Just type in the legacy of Nomi Malone. That's what the episode's called. But I think you're right. Like he does walk that very fine line, and it yeah, I think one of the things that helps it is the fact that the use of sex, it feels very minimal in this.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
yes, like there are a few like love scenes. There is a girl that masturbates in front of another girl, and but they're very quick. Like it's never like we stay here so long. And I think that's really, to your point, what helps it and kind of avoid that male gaze that we get so much here in the United States so many times when you have like girl on girl. Like it's
Yeah.
always got to be this like almost like borderline pornographic depictions in movies.
Well, and just to think about another French film, Blue is the Warmest Color, that came out, a while back, that is also about a lesbian relationship. Like, I don't think this story's central plot is about this sexual discovery or this relationship. Like, I think it's kind of more of a side effect of what else is going on with Benedetta and her being able to explore that because of the position that she's put herself in. But something like Blue is the Warmest Color is like a coming of age, self discovery, sexual exploration story. And I don't think I would look at this one in the same way.
Absolutely not. I think that you would be doing a huge disservice to this film if you looked at it in that way.
Yeah.
And one thing that really helps this movie is the everything that you have coming into it. Like it's not just a love story between two women. It's
Mm-mm.
so much grander than that. I feel like for like the first half of this, like first quarter of this podcast, we focused so much on like we've fallen into the press trap of we're just talking about all of the lesbian stuff, and this movie is so much more. So like let's run down and like give like a quick synopsis real quick, and then we'll throw up a spoiler warning. So this movie is actually a biopic. It tells the story of a 17th century nun that experiences visions of Jesus around the time of the Black Plague, happens to fall in love with a woman, and is ultimately the downfall of her own visions, essentially, or pride, or whatever you want to call it. But it's Benedetta. That's what it is. You guys can rent it right now from IFC, wherever you guys get your movies from. It's $6.99. It's worth every
It's
freaking penny.
so worth it. It is so worth the rental. So worth it. If and nothing else, like even if the story for you is just like way too bananas, like it is a beautifully made movie.
Yeah, so many people were surprised when like I shared my reaction online, because I'm in a couple of like film groups on Facebook, and I shared my reaction. I was like, this is like one of the best movies I've seen in the last year. Like
Mm-hmm.
so it's a full 5-star film. Like it's rich, it's thought-provoking, it's
Yeah.
provocative, but also to your point, like it looks stunning. Like the set
Gorgeous.
design for it is just breathtaking. And I think that's really what helps elevate this film, is that it feels very immersive, that you're kind of like a fly on the wall for a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, that's the perfect way to describe it, I think, because it really does. It almost to me like, and I know that you and I have a similar background in the theater arts, but it really does have like a theater set design feel to me. Like it just very much feels like you're on the set of a grand scale theater performance, like very much so like of that time. Like if you were to go see like a piece of theater during that time, it's this big courtyard in between the church and the town around it, and it's so beautiful. But yeah, it's a really well done movie. If I don't have to like get up to go get a snack or use the bathroom or something, and I have to sit there and watch the movie start to finish, especially in the time of the pandemic, like that to me is like job well done. You've kept my interest start to finish.
Never heard someone call it the pandemic.
Oh, you clearly don't listen to the podcast that I listen to then.
I love that though. Well, so this is the official spoiler warning, and I'm going to talk about. I think one of the things that the Verhoeven does so well with this movie is I approach this movie as I'm a Christian, so it's like I
Mm-hmm.
still kind of filter a lot of the content through that lens from time to time. And one of the things that, the fact that this is a movie that is dealing with religious undertones and social commentaries on those undertones is I have so much to say about this. But one of the things that I think that Verhoeven does really well stylistically is the fact that it's kind of like left almost like open-ended to where you can
Yes.
kind of think, oh, she was experiencing these visions, but then also was she really like, or was she's just a mastermind to kind of hide her,
Yeah.
forbidden love?
Those are honestly my one of my favorite kinds of stories are the ones where a lot of room for interpretation is left up to the audience and you can make of it what you will. I took this fantastic class in grad school called psychotic women in horror. And a lot of, I know, I think I've mentioned this to you before, but I keep meaning to see if I can find the reading list and the watch list. But a lot of the movies we watched, it was kind of, well, how do we define psychotic? Because a lot of the characters we're looking at are female characters that are being persecuted for maybe it's revolutionary ideas at the time that they're being had. Maybe it's mental illness that we're treating in a different way. Are they visions that somebody like Benedetta is having, but we can't prove them. We're relying on faith as opposed to science or proof. So it's this kind of fit in with that. I wouldn't necessarily call this a horror film, but there is something horrific about it, just based on like what's going on at the time. So I could see where a movie like this would fit in to that course that I took.
Absolutely, and I think that was kind of my wanting to my curiosity about this movie was the fact that there are some demonic undertones to this as well. And one of the things that I think Verhoeven does is so open ended. And it is really heartbreaking at the end that basically she went from this like really like high, lofty, respected position within the church that she was serving in to basically like being fed scraps
Yeah.
until her last days. And I just thought that was just like wild. But one of the things that I, because I don't know about you, but like watching like biopics and like if a biopic really like interests me and like really hits me, like I want to know more about the
Yep.
inspiration behind that movie. So I did a quick like I did like a little bit of Google search, and apparently, according to Wikipedia,
Oh, I went down that Wikipedia hole right with you. So I want to hear the receipts that
uh
you've got.
I'm gonna probably mispronounce this names because I absolutely suck at names. But how would you pronounce her like girlfriend's name in this? Is it Bartolomea?
Bartolomea,
How do you say it?
Bartholomea, Bartolomea. I
Bartholomew,
don't know if it's a hard T or not.
or just say Bart. What did I say it
Bart
again? Yeah, we'll just
Bartolomea.
Bartolomea. She gave her testimony that Benedetta engaged in fontage with her while possessed by the spirit of a male demon known as Splentello.
Mm-hmm. I did read that as well, and I thought that was interesting. They left that out of the narrative, but I don't necessarily see them leaving that out as like a negative thing.
I think if you put that in there, it takes away from that open-endedness.
Yeah.
Because when I watched it the first time, there are parts of this movie where I was like, man, like she like really was like, and I'm gonna get really vulnerable with you guys in here. Um, like I've had moments where like I've been around people and they've had a prophetic word or seen a like prophetic vision, and I've seen that
Mm,
come to pass. And I've also had stuff happen in my own lives where like I've gotten visions from God and they've come to pass.
mm.
And I know that saying that kind of makes me look weird if you don't understand it or understand the context. If you would like to know more, you can DM us on any of our social medias, and I'll be happy to explain. But there are like watching this the first time, I was like, okay, like I've seen this, like okay, I can kind of see this, and then I caught that open endedness at the second viewing where I was like, maybe she's like really possessed by a demon, and it kind of becomes like apparent when anytime that like she's like challenged, like uh when they find the dildo in the third act, like she just kind of like plays it up as like, nope, you're blaspheming, get out of here, it is not I who is the blasphemer. But she was like, she always has this like habit of like kind of like going in this like really dark borderline demonic rage.
Yeah, well, and I kind of like not knowing. Like I personally like not knowing one way or the other. Like I like that we can interpret it differently. And this is coming from somebody who has no religious background whatsoever, who the only time I've spent in church has been at the occasional wedding. And so I do find religion in general like really fascinating. I love hearing people's stories about their religious experiences. And so I can't say that I believe in one thing or another, but just watching Benedetta, she makes a great case for wanting to believe, like, because especially because she gets so many people to believe in what she's telling them, that I want to believe in the good in people. I want to believe that somebody isn't lying about something like that, that somebody isn't making these visions up as a way to seek attention, as a way to, hopefully make themselves a deity of sorts, and so I want to believe in her and I try to, but there were those moments of doubt, especially when she would have this vision of, the crucifixion. And then the next thing we see is like her having these, what is it called when it's like the marks all of a sudden like appear on your body? There's a stigmata. That's what and so she would have what we assume is like stigmata marks on her hands, like the crucifixion. But then we find a piece of pottery laying on the ground. Did she stab herself? Did she stab herself because God told her to? Or was this like her way of bringing the fantasy or the vision to life? I mean, there's so many moments like that. And we see people question her and we see what happens to the people who question her. And so I think that's the other thing that makes you want to believe in her more, is the people who don't believe in her are the ones who are punished.
Yeah, so there's two things that I want to address with that real quick. Is I want to define what a stigmata is, because
Okay.
Not everyone knows what a stigmata is, and I think, I don't know, stigmatas, if you guys want to hear a little bit more on like the church's relationship to like demons, we put out a 2-part episode a couple years ago called the Demons and Mental Health. I highly recommend it. We sat down with a demonologist and answered your questions. But a stigmata is bodily marks, scars, or pains corresponding to those of the crucified of Jesus Christ, that is on the hands and the feet, near the heart, and sometimes on the head, from the crown of thorns and the shoulders and his back, carrying the cross and scourging. So like there are several scenes in here that kind of like try to deconstruct Benedetta's stigmata, and so much of it actually comes from Sister Felicia. And there are definitely like scenes in this movie where like the words or the visions of Benedetta actually come to pass. And I think the one that is most notable is the Black Plague one, where she's like, this comet has been sent by God so that as a sign that he's going to spare us from the Black Plague, but you have to keep the doors closed. And the moment that they open the doors up, boom, the
Guess
Black
who
Plague
shows
comes
up?
in.
The plague. What's up? Yeah. So I mean, it is interesting. Like I happen to be a very pessimistic person, or you know what, let's say realistic. And so for me, it's hard for me to look at Benedetta as anything but an earlier version of like an influencer. Like that's kind of how I envision if like Benedetta was alive today, just sort of like how I would see her would be as like an influencer of sorts, in that it's like she gains this following and everybody is invested in the things that she's saying, and she's just very smart, but there were moments too where I was believing, and I think she believes. I guess that's the bigger question for me, is does she believe in what she's saying, in what she's sharing with people, or does she know herself that she's just playing a game, that she's just out there saying these things? And I don't know. I don't have the answer. I that's why I find it so compelling to think about.
If you or someone you know is listening to this podcast right now and you're struggling with suicide, addiction, self-harm, or depression, we encourage you guys to please reach out. This is the heartbeat of why we do what we do. Suicide is currently the 10th leading cause of death in the United States, and as of this recording, there are 132 suicides that take place each and every day on American soil. And when you scale back internationally, there are 800,000 successful suicides. That is one death roughly every 40 seconds. So if you or someone you know is struggling, you guys can go to victimsandvillains.net/hope. That resource is going to be right in the description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this. There you'll find resources that include the National Suicide Lifeline, which is 1-800-273-8255. You can also text HELP to 741-741. We also have a plethora of other resources, including churches, getting connected with counselors, LGBT resources like the Trevor Project, and also veteran hotline as well. Please, if you hear nothing else in the show, understand that you listening to this right now, have value and worth. We get it. Suicide, depression, mental health, these are hard topics, and the stigma around them doesn't make it any easier. But please consider the resources right in the descriptions below, wherever you guys are listening, because once again, you have value and you have worth. So please stay with us. I think that is a wonderful way to put it. Like, she was an influencer before we actually had influencers. And I think when you get to see her kind of come out of the gate for the first time, and she's like presented with the crowd right before her, what would have been her burning, you can kind of see the influence that she had. But there is one thing that I want to pull from this, and listeners can, but there is a specific passage of scripture that actually talks about, whether or not someone is, claiming of visions, whether or not they're from God or from, other sources. And so it says, beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether or not they are from God. For many false prophets have gone out into the world, and by this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come into the flesh, and every spirit that does not confess that Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which is, you have heard from, was coming and is now in the world already. It was 1 John 4:1-3. But largely, I think, it even talks about, there's another scripture in 1 Peter that talks about how the be on guard, because the devil can disguise himself as an angel of light. So it's always this kind of like thing that you should like test these things, but that's always kind of something that I feel like we as a church kind of don't do, because I've been raised in the church. I've never heard anyone talk that way until about like 4 or 5 years ago. And so, I think that there are a lot of denominations out there that kind of believe a lot of like the supernatural aspects of the Bible kind of lived and died with Jesus. And then you have others that still believe that it's still very much alive and well.
Yeah.
And so you have this kind of this disconnect that happens, but in the long run, so it's like you could look at Benedetta and be like, yes, she very much was experiencing these visions from God, but then you could also kind of say, well, she's not. And I want to just cross all my T's and dot my I's. I'm just going to put this into perspective, is that we are not going to even address the LGBT uh, portion of this into question, because that's another can of worms that I just don't want to get into.
Fair
Um,
enough.
but yeah, so it is very interesting, and the fact that some of the people took them at their words. And I think one of the quotes that I wrote down was Sister Felicia, who was the appress mother, who's they
She's
never explain what an appress is.
the mother superior. She was the mother superior of
Okay.
the convent until Benedetta, who's like, 20, whatever, is like put on a pedestal and they're like,
Hold
you're
my
going to be
beer.
the new one.
Yeah, so she comes into it and she ends up taking it, and I think it's her daughter that walks away from her, but it's like the first
Yeah.
encounter. It's like one of the first nights that Benedetta is actually in the convent, and she's praying to the Virgin Mary, and they have this like miracle happens, and as they're walking away, Apris Felicia has said, miracles says something along the lines of like miracles are like mushrooms, and they're more trouble. They're usually more trouble than they're worth.
Yeah, she to me was the most interesting character in the whole movie. Like, I was fascinated with her start to finish because we meet her where she's raising her daughter in this convent, which, first of all, I'm like, that's really interesting to me that we have a nun who not only is a nun, but is like the mother superior of this convent. And she has an actual daughter with her. Like, we don't think about that because I feel like traditionally we associate nuns with being chaste and not having children or husbands or whatever. And so I thought that was really interesting.
But there's also the life before Christ. So
Yes.
like
Oh,
there's always that
absolutely.
exchange where like anytime that a person comes to salvation, you're
Hmm.
still carrying the baggage. Like I think sometimes as a Christian, we have this tendency to people be like, if I come to Christ or if I come and I get saved, it's going to be a band-aid and like my life's going to be
Yeah.
easy and all this other stuff. And that's not always the case. That's you're kind of opening yourself up to like a whole new set of problems essentially, but you still exist with your existing problems and the
Yeah.
results of said problems.
Well, and I love that we got to see that because I mean, I personally haven't seen that. I haven't seen any representation of somebody, specifically a nun within the church in any kind of movie or TV show where they've had a child before they've come into the church. Like, I found that really fascinating. And so I was like, great, this is already adding a layer to this woman that I've never seen before. So she's teaching her own daughter, about miracles being dangerous in a way that, like, don't put too much stock into this. And I think she's just a really interesting woman because I also love the dynamic between her daughter and her when she gets when we fast forward like a good 10 years or so into the future, because her daughter is the one that's the first one to question Benedetta like outright, and she says to her own daughter, like, I'm telling you, don't do this. Like, this is not, I'm not going to lie for you and I don't want you to lie. And she really kind of throws her daughter to the wolves when it comes down to it because she will not lie. She sticks true to her word, regardless of who that's going to affect, even if it's her own flesh and blood. And so I really loved her a lot.
Yeah, she is one of the most fascinating characters within this
Yes.
movie, because I think that there are so many people that I've met and interacted with in my life, is that like when you come to relationship with Christ or you come to have the salvation, you oftentimes have this like fire that is like very new and exciting. It's like the equivalent of like buying that like long awaited book or movie and like finally being able to like dig into it. And then after a while, that fire eventually starts to fade out, and you kind of start to become almost jaded towards the
Yeah.
source of that fire. And they did such a great job at conveying that with her character.
Mm.
And also at the same time, there's a scene where after Benedetta's already found out, of her and Bartholomew's relationship, and she's kind of being prepared to be burnt the next day.
Mm-hmm.
There's a scene after Felicia's been revealed to have the Black Plague, where she goes down and actually like is like consulting her, and she basically just like flat out says, you never really believed. Like it's always kind of been this like routine. I think that's a lot of what we get into is that Christianity can sometimes be, and any religion really can be like very routine. Like there's
Mm-hmm.
something about it that you no longer uh find fascinating. And it doesn't just have to be religion. I mean, it can be marriage can get stuck in the same rut, or a relationship where like the sparks that you had when you first started dating, eventually, because you're just kind of going with the flow and going at the motions, like you're not um you're not keeping that spark alive. Like it's just kind of
Yeah.
like it's being held on by life support essentially, and Felicia represents that so immaculately.
Yeah. Hang on to a safe space, a place that's like provided you a home, literally, in a time where, I mean, your options as a woman at this time, it seems like, are your father's daughter. And we actually get to see that represented with a few of the characters, but like with Bartholomew, we see what her father has like put her through. You get to be a wife, so you belong to a different man, different property owner, or you enter a convent, and even that doesn't come free, because they really have made a business out of what it means. I have to tell you too, like I read in romance novels all the time where they send someone away to a convent, or we're going to send her off to the convent, and they've never mentioned money in it before. So I found that really interesting, that they really focused a lot on like church as a moneymaker. So I think between that and the roles that women play and sort of how the church services women, like there are honestly a lot of parallels that you can draw from this movie that takes place in a time long before our own and 2022.
I was just about to say that, like, I think this movie, like, does there's because of it kind of almost has that timelessness to it, right? Where it's like, even like stepping outside of the church, there's a great documentary that they released a few years ago that I wish I could remember the name of, but like
Mm.
talks about like women's role in Hollywood and how this is like a male dominated role, like game essentially, like and basically one of the things that I think this movie does really well is that, like, yeah, like there's always that power struggle with women. One of the things that and I'm speaking as a white male, like, but it is heartbreaking when you hear the numbers of like how many women were making movies last year as compared to the men, like
Ugh.
that. It's like, I mean, it's like night and day.
Yeah.
um, but I think also at the same time, like it's that power struggle, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that now you're starting to see this like shift happen where you have things like the Me Too movement, where you're saying enough is enough. Like, not only are we tired of being harassed, but we're tired of being treated like second class citizens, which
Mm.
I think this movie does a good job at kind of like also like putting like the power dynamic in like the center focus, especially during the back half of this movie.
Yeah, when we start to bring in I I'm terrible with names to start with, and then when we add in the fact that they're all French, it just like, goes past my mind altogether. So I started calling the character I'm thinking of Daddy Church. And I know that that's not his name, but he's the one that they go to for like approval, and he's the one that the former Mother Superior calls on to prove Benedetta as false.
I think his name and or title was Nuncia or
Yes, there
Nuncio.
we go. Okay, cool. not Daddy Church.
I mean, you can call him Daddy Church if you really want to.
Church Daddy. No, I think what's interesting too, especially with him, and I call her Mother Superior, but it's Sister Felicia.
Alicia, yeah.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, especially with the two of them, because they're like the two ongoing like naysayers, like out to prove Benedetta as being false, is just sort of this idea of like, well, because we're higher in power, why hasn't God spoken to us? Why hasn't Jesus spoken to us? Why would he choose this, nobody, this 20 something girl who hasn't dedicated her life to the church? Like, it's not fair. It's not, we are higher up. We've put in more time. We've put in more money. Like, when do we get our due? And so I did think that was an interesting thing to explore in like the second half of the movie.
I mean, and with that too, like it's like the power struggle, or at least like the hierarchy as we kind of know it within the church, the church system in Western culture. That's a dangerous game to play, because as a Christian and as a mental health enthusiast, one of the things that we have this tendency of doing is we look towards one person and we put all that pressure onto like one person on how to live our lives, what to eat, what to drink. And there's a great passage in Matthew where Jesus talks about, not to be anxious about anything, but to, seek him. And that's an open invitation to literally anyone hearing this podcast, that you can have that. And there's actually, I think, another common misconception that people think about the church is like, if I come to Jesus, all of my problems will go away and I'll be cured. And that's not it at all. Like, yes, there are steps to take in place, but because you're placing that unfair expectation of power upon a pastor, a pope, a mother superior, whatever the authority figure is, there's actually a really high suicide rate and or depression rate in pastors because of said expectations.
Yeah, and you know what, that doesn't surprise me, sadly, like, especially because, like you're saying, because you're putting so much pressure on somebody, say all your problems don't magically go away, as we know that they're not going to. You have somebody to blame. Then nobody is going to blame Jesus. Nobody is going to blame God. They are going to blame the tangible person in front of them. And that's exactly what we see happen with the nuncia too, is that they have the opportunity to convict and burn Benedetta at the stake. And what does everybody do? They turn on this man in power. They're going to take him down. He is responsible for bringing the plague to their town. Literally, we see it. And he is responsible for taking away this woman that has given them nothing but hope. He's the one causing all your problems because of that. So get rid of him, get rid of the problems. Like, it's the easy solve all thing, is we want somebody to give us hope, but we also want somebody to blame.
Yeah, it's that catch-22. That's a very dangerous, poisonous place to be, because like in the long run, like I think we see this with mental health in general, where we don't ever want to be the ones that have to look back on ourselves and see ourselves in a negative light. So we're going to cast those negative reflections of ourselves, and we're gonna go, okay, well, it's God's fault, it's the pastor's fault, it's the nun's fault, it's my neighbor's fault, it's every fault but my own. And one of the things that I think this film does really well is there's that scene between Benedetta and his like role is like never expressed, like he's like a father kind of. But she's like confessing that she's been like having these visions.
Oh, okay, got it. Not the nuncia, the guy who's like the local.
Yeah, so like
giant
I don't know what
guitars.
he like because they never give him a
Okay,
name, so we're just gonna call him the in-house pastor dude. We can call him Daddy
perfect.
Church. Um,
Okay.
unless you had a better name for him.
There's Church Daddy and then there's Big Church Daddy. He's just like
Okay,
local Church Daddy.
local church daddy. Um, LCD. Um, as he's come to be known. Um, he talks about how like there is like we come closer to God through suffering.
Yeah.
And that's not entirely like not wrong. And I'm gonna bring it back up. Um, but I think one of the things that is really worth noting is that like even if you don't believe in God, like you can look and still see that like you know where you grow are the times where you have the hardest seasons.
Mm.
Um, but I think I think this really works with the message of the movie. It comes from Romans 5:3-5, and it says, "Not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope that does not put us to shame, because God's love poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us." But like even that centralized like thoughts, even if you like don't agree necessarily with what the thing is saying, like knowing that like suffering, it'll produce endurance, and endurance will produce character, and character hope. Like that through line, like you can literally take that into any religion, any culture, and
Hmm.
any person, and that is going to be a fact, because the times where you feel the most challenged are the times where you're going to grow the best.
Yeah. No, and I think you're right. I think that applies to everybody, regardless of, whether you're talking about religion, relationships, like that's how we learn. We learn from our mistakes. We learn and we grow and hopefully do better or become better or make better choices the next time.
Yeah, just don't like use your position of seniority to make people stick their hands in boiling hot water. That's not
Oof.
necessarily what it means to suffer.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's what's interesting too about kind of seeing. I know we see Benedetta as a child, and then we see her, I don't want to say like in her adolescent years, but like her young adult growing into being a woman, a young woman years. And we see her learning like, well, okay, I've been told that we need to focus on enduring pain. Okay, maybe this wasn't the right way to do it, is to put somebody's hand in hot water. And first of all, it's also not my job to make somebody else feel pain for them to learn. I need to focus on myself. So we kind of got to see like the trial and error for like what she could and couldn't, I don't want to say like get away with, but just sort of like what was working for her personal journey and what was not working.
That's another thing too that I'm glad you brought up. Like, what works for someone doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for
Mm.
someone else. And so much of the healing process is putting yourself out there for everyone, like being
Mm.
vulnerable enough to like try different things, whether that's trying the process of like finding the right therapist, or finding a right artistic outlet, whether that's podcasting, film critiquing, YouTube, Twitch, uh podcasting, painting, that list goes on and on. But I think you see that really well with um the even the relationship between Bartholomew and Benedetta, where like Benedetta, like clearly from the first frame, like she has always viewed the church as kind of like her living hope. Like
Yeah.
this is the thing that like works for her. And Bartholomew just she's just trying to survive day to day. And you kind of have to have, again, it's one of those things that what works for some doesn't necessarily work for others.
it's interesting because I feel like a lot of elements, especially with like Bartholomew's story, are like a fish out of water story, because she's the one who comes to the church having never really, thought about it. She's clearly got like a whole bunch of baggage coming in. She's just looking for something, some kind of safety net, some sort of connection, something to have, but it's not told from her point of view. Like it's not really her story. It's how does she fit in Benedetta's story? So it is interesting to kind of experience a fish out of water story without following the fish, and instead like following somebody else that's like the guide instead.
I love that so much. It's not wrong. I truly do really love that. I think it's an accurate depiction of their relationship. How would you guys like to help us get mental health resources into schools, conventions, and other events? Well, now you can. Simply go to patreon.com/victims and villains for as little as $1 a month. You guys can help us get mental health resources into current and upcoming generations, educate and break down stigma surrounding mental health, suicide, and depression. And you get exclusive content that you can't get anywhere else. And you guys can tell us which Nicolas Cage movie you want us to cover, and we'll do it. All it takes to get started is to go to patreon.com/victims and villains, or simply click the link in the episode description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this episode. Pick your tier and get started today. Yes, it's that simple. So quickly select the tier that you want and help us get hope into the hands of the depressed and the suicidal today.
Yeah, could have been a different movie, but I like Benedetta's point of view, just because I don't know what to believe even after, watching it and reading the Wikipedia page about it.
So wild. Like I really want a documentary too, like that just kind of goes along like a companion piece. I'm really hoping that IFC will bring this to Blu-ray to the United States. But if they don't, I'm willing to learn French to dig it, to have the French release.
There you go. Authentic.
Authentic. I gotta be authentic. There is something else that like this movie does that I kind of do want to address. So there's a scene where Felicia's daughter actually commits suicide.
Yeah.
And there's again, there is a divide within the church that, there are people out there that believe suicide is it's a mortal sin. If you do it, like it is, you can't get into heaven or something like that. You're automatically bound for hell. And then there are other people out there that don't really believe that. And here's where the gray area is that, and at least to my knowledge, like there's not any like where in the Bible that says one way or the other.
Interesting. Well, we know that a lot of people interpret things from, I'll say specifically the Bible, the way that they want them to be interpreted. This, we see this a lot in just the world today. I can't speak to it because I, for one, have never read the Bible myself. So I mean, I will never pretend like I know what is or is not in the Bible verbatim.
That's fair. And I think too, like the reason why like it hit me so hard of watching that scene, and like I actually had to like pause the movie and like decompress for a few minutes, because like it adds to my frustration where there seem to be like these like taboo topics that the church just won't address, and suicide is one of them. So I think that's where you had that disconnect, is because like we don't really have the cojones to address it. Mental health, hell, like I mean there's a lot of like taboo hot topic buttons that we just don't talk about, and suicide just happens to be one of them. And so then you have this like disconnect, is like, well, like what do you do with how do you console a family that has experienced a death about something you don't even talk about? We kind of are underprepared in that regard.
Interesting. Well, and as the plague like enters their town and everything, village, let's be honest. The only characters who we actually do see commit suicide are Sister Felicia and her daughter. Because I mean, at the end, she's the one that walks into the fire. And I think a lot of people could argue that the two of them were the ones who, throughout the movie, are like the ones so intent on doing what's right and so intent on like making sure things are done. They doubt Benedetta because they think she's telling lies, making things up, that she shouldn't be talking that way about God. And they're the two who do commit suicide. But the two that I would think, I'm like, oh no, like in my mind, these are the women destined for heaven. Like these are the women who have spent their lives, like, doing good, and they're still trying to do it. But did they just give up on the world they were trying to do good in? I don't, it's a tough situation to think about.
This is a really tough situation because sometimes it just does feel hopeless. Like there are,
Yeah.
you know, and I mean, like, even again, like stepping back from religion, like, even in life, like, life just has those moments where it just feels hopeless. No matter
Yeah.
what you do, it just feels like you're overwhelmed. Like, this week in general, the week that we're recording this, like, has been a week where, like, I have had a lot of sleepless nights,
Mm,
but it hasn't been because of, good and bad days. It's been because of just like, well, I guess it has been, but it's been like the nights have been good, but like the days have been kind of like crap. But so you have to kind of like balance those. And like, that's the thing about like doing life with people is that A, it's going to get messy, and B, you're going to be at this position where it's like you're constantly looking on how to grow.
mm-hmm.
And again, that it goes back to that, taking those moments where like you have suffering, instead of wallowing in it, saying like how can I grow from this?
Yeah. And thankfully, we have a lot more opportunities available to us today than Benedetta and the world of what, I don't even remember what the time period was. Was it
17th
1600s?
century.
Okay, so 1600s. Yeah, there we go. So yeah, lots changed since then. People can still feel the same kinds of feelings, but we have a lot of better options for how to process these feelings today.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this movie does a good job with that too. So I mean, is there anything else that you feel like we should address in this movie?
I don't know. I really did. I think this is a really interesting movie. Like if I was, like I said, if I was taking that psychotic women in horror class, there is something really horrific about this that I do think you could apply this film towards. If I was teaching a course on women's studies or women in history, like I think there's a lot of great takeaways from this. And obviously like LGBTQ, anything in queer or gender studies, like I think this would be a great film to watch. Like there's just so many layers there that whether come from a religious background or you have a vested interest in religion, that's just one piece of this comprehensive puzzle that Paul Verhoeven has put together. Oh, and we didn't really touch on it, but the performances are fantastic. Like
So good.
these actors are incredible. Like they're just so realistic. And we both said it. You don't know what to believe. You don't know who to believe. So they've accomplished their mission of like making you want to believe in all of them and like trust all of them. So they did a fantastic job. Like I would 100% recommend this movie.
I think one of the last things that I want to talk about too is that yeah, I mentioned the hot topics of suicide and mental health and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Sex is another one that I think kind of gets downplayed a lot within Christian cultures and Christian circles.
Mm.
And um in the 90s there was the purity movement, purity
Oof.
culture.
Oof.
Yeah, see, not even being in the church, you know exactly what that is. And
Yep.
that I think that damaged me like real hardcore. Like I probably would say like it's only been within like the last like 4 or 5 years that like I've truly kind of like deconstructed and
Yeah.
like walked away from a lot of that stuff.
Well, and I wasn't even in the church, and that still affected the way that women my age were raised, like growing up in, the 90s and 2000s, like whether you were part of the church or not. So, I mean, I think it really made its way into the mainstream culture in general. So, yeah, I mean, you're right. You don't see a lot of sex in general in relation with religion, which is probably why somebody who, I host a romance novel podcast. There are not a lot of books that touch on characters' religions, like within those stories. I can think of maybe like a few that would take up one hand, but it is something where I know we see it differently in maybe a more modern context, that yeah, you can have a healthy sex life and believe in whoever you believe in, but stop showing me weird memes on your phone.
It's not a meme. It's a book that I came across today, and it's
Really?
called Pastors Eat Pussy Too.
Oh my God, that looks like a cover that somebody like put together. You know what? It's probably like a free Kindle book that somebody.
Is a free Kindle book.
Yeah, that sounds about right. With a title like that.
So
Love it though.
so shout out to the author Juan Mills for that.
Yeah, I will say I did read a romance last year where the main male character was a rabbi. And so I was like, "Oh, that's cool. I like that." But yeah, not enough religion and sex coming together.
Yeah, there again, there's like that disconnect because it's weird. I watched the documentary right after the my first viewing, and they said this documentary said it perfectly. Is like that we're with the purity movement, you interchange virginity to be purity, and that's not always the case.
Not the same thing.
No, because
Not for
like
me at
I
least.
mean, yeah, I mean, you can have people that will do hit all the bases but won't go home runs. And then you can have people that have hit all the home runs and then have found a newfound purity
Mm-hmm.
afterwards. And it's just really interesting to me that like we use those interchangeably, and because we've used those interchangeably, like you've damaged an entire generation both in the church and outside of the church of what it means to have the viewpoints of sex and meaningful relationships and etc.
Yeah, which is disappointing. And I will say the sex scenes that we do get in the movie are very well, okay. One of them I can think of is it's very tender. It's very sweet and coming of age. Like it's a beautiful love scene. Like it is a making love scene. And it's just it's a way to show sex in a beautiful way, that it doesn't have to be. It's the difference, but to swear a little bit, it's the difference between making love and fucking. Like that, there can be a difference between the two, and neither of them are dirty and neither of them are wrong, but just that we can look at this in a fresh way. And so yeah, I thought they were handled really beautifully. Again, I had my doubts, especially just as somebody who's read a lot of film scripts and worked in development and seen a lot of stories from men about women that just in a sexual way depict women in a specific manner that is not I don't want to say, it's not positive. It's not, and so I had my reservations, and I do think it defied my expectations. Like I think it was really well done.
Yeah, I think to that point, I think this movie does. Yeah, it's it's very passionate, that one scene you're talking about in particular.
Yeah.
and you can feel the genuine love and connection between those two, both ladies, and Bar- Bartholomew and Benedetta. Like, you have those two connections, like, even to the point where, like, in the end, like, they're separated and they're getting ready to be trialed for this taboo relationship. Like, Benedetta even says to Nunzio, she goes, says something along the lines of, like, Bartholomew is like I keep saying the name wrong and different every
Bart.
time.
Just stick with
Just
Bart.
Bart. Bart is like my entrance point into love, and it's through her and Christ that, like, I'm able to love all. And I think that, like, when you find, like, true love, like, that's what it's like. Like, you know, I had lots of imitations in with love dating in high school, and never really felt love until, like, the love that Benedetta is talking about till I met my wife. And so, like, I can second that as as someone that's been with the same person for 10 years now. 11,
Nice.
11, sorry. Um we were teenagers. Um but to that point, my wife watched it with me the second time,
Mm-hmm.
and the second scene we're talking about in particular is so Benedetta in the beginning of the movie has a Virgin Mary that her mother gives her. And in the second act of the movie, that is it is transformed into a
Into
dildo.
a dildo,
My
Got to make
wife
do
watched
with
it
what
with
you got.
my wife watched it with me, and she just, like, she's like knitting while she's watching it, and she just, like, looks up, she goes, "That's a dildo." I was like,
Mm.
"Yeah." And then she, like flips it around, and she sees that it's the Mother Mary. She was just, like, beside herself. It was very funny to see her reaction.
I mean, it's a thing. And that was actually one of the things I did think about throughout was just sort of like Mary, because I know, throughout Benedetta saying that like she's Jesus's wife, like she's like pledged herself to be Jesus's wife. And in regards to that, Mary would be like her mother. Okay. So it's interesting, like just sort of her point of view when she first enters the church. She's kneeling down to pray in front of Mary. She has the statuette of Mary. Eventually, they turn this statuette of Mary into a dildo. And then from there, it's kind of like, I don't know, I kind of interpret it as like she kind of pushes Mary aside. She like outgrows Mary because she wants to elevate herself to like that status. Like, why worship this woman when I can be the one that people worship? Like, I'm learning from Mary and I'm taking it on to be somebody even better, even bigger. Because after the dildo moment with Mary, I don't think we actually really see her praying to Mary anymore, but we see people on their knees praying to her and like trying to save her from being burned at the stake. So a little bit of a transformation there.
I didn't even think about that or catch that. That's a really, really solid conclusion there. But she does kneel in she kneels after she, like, masturbates, and
Ah,
she, like, hasn't quite reached climax yet, and then she, like, falls down on her knees and, like, repents, and, like, then we get the final act of the movie. But no, that's a very, very valid point, is that she's kind of like looking as Mary as almost kind of like, well, this is who I worship. And the terminology bride of Christ, I believe that is strictly a Catholic belief.
I had never heard of that. And I was like, I don't know if this is like a product of the times, like if this is something that was happening with the church at this time. And like, we kind of changed from that. Like, I found that really interesting because she's basically sold by her parents into being a bride of Christ when she's like 10 years old. So I was like, this is that was actually one of the first things that after watching this movie, I did want to like dive into the Wikipedia hole about, because I was like, I want to know more about this specific time period, not just with Benedetta, but like with the church in general.
So the so the phrase bride of Christ in the Catholic circles, from my understanding, is that's what the nuns are called, and those that like pledge themselves to the church, because that's the reason why they are celibate. But in Christian circles, the bride of Christ refers to the church as a whole.
Okay. I mean, that's it. I don't have anything else to add to that way. It's interesting.
Yeah. So I think that's gonna do it for us on this episode. But if you guys need a little bit more sexy talk, you guys can check out Kelly's podcast. But if you like sexy visuals, she also does a I don't know, it's like a TV series, it's like a web series, like
Which one are we talking about? Are we talking about Instagram? Are we talking about YouTube? Which one?
Oh, I'm talking about your like you have like 3 episodes of it out.
Oh,
You've
my
like
web
acted.
series.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, I wrote and directed and starred in, I hate being that person, a web series.
That's no big deal.
A couple years
Triple
ago.
thread.
Exactly. God, I can't. But yeah, it's called Misrepresent, and it's very much about like women and their gender roles today. So it was fun to shoot. We're hoping to make a lot more in the near future, but you can always watch that on YouTube, and you can find the podcast anywhere you listen to your podcast. So there you go.
Well, you guys can find us everywhere at Victims and Villains. We are on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Twitch, YouTube, Patreon, and wherever you guys get your podcasts from. Go to victimsandvillains.net to get all of those links, more podcasts like the ones you're listening to right now, and movie reviews, along with our mental health resource library as well, all of which you guys can find links for in the show notes below, including Kelly's podcast and web series. So thank you guys for hanging out and talking about some French movies and some history lessons and a bunch of other things. Until next time, take care, guys.